inviting us to take part of today's event, this 5th Global Peace Summit, focusing on the right of education. It is a great pleasure to be here with you, especially amongst so many youth. It kind of makes me feel even younger. So as many of you may have heard, we're at what has been now called the Decade of Action. It's something that I can clearly see in the poster that you have created for this event. We're starting a new year in 2023, which also reminds us that we have 7 years left to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals outlined in the 2030 Agenda. We know that with the Millennium Development Goals, not all were achieved. Now we're striving towards this new set of 17 goals, and it is something that, despite the big challenges we have, should not discourage us, but rather encourage us to work together stronger. We all understand what education can do for a person's life. I think the Vice Chancellor Kumar pointed it very well. It is a catalyst for a better nation, a better democracy, a better human life. Despite this, not enough is being done across the world to make education accessible, affordable, and of quality for all people. And those are 3 words, 3 priorities that I will be coming back to in my speech. Before the pandemic, the world was already facing a significant challenge in fulfilling the promise of ensuring a quality education. COVID-19 brought social and economic disruptions like we had never seen before, during which the right of education was significantly affected. What happened during the pandemic? I think we all know it. The existing disparities in the education system were revealed, affecting the most vulnerable: poor communities, rural communities. Low levels of digitalization and long-standing structural weaknesses were brought up by the crisis. The closure of educational centers also jeopardized the provision of essential services to children, like the nutrition that is provided in schools for children of disadvantaged families. It also affected the ability of many parents, especially women, to work, bringing to surface the unequal gender roles in terms of unpaid care responsibilities, which we know are much greater in mothers and grandmothers. Far from discouraging us, like I said, these existing challenges should reinforce our commitment to work in a more coordinated manner among all members of society. I think, again, Vice Chancellor pointed out that this is not a responsibility only of governments or of the education sector, but of society at all. And I think something that's important of the 2030 Agenda is that it calls for public-private partnerships. The private sector has a very important role to fulfill in this, and I think this is something that we may hear more when Reshmi, that I had the pleasure of meeting this morning, will talk about the NGO she's working with. I come from a relatively small country of 5.1 million people. I was looking at how much was the population of Lucknow, and I understand it's about 4 million. So just roughly bigger than Lucknow is the country where I come from. Costa Rica is recognized for its peace, for its stability, for its democracy and environmental policies. 74 years ago, our leaders took the decision to voluntarily, and it was the first country in the world to do it, to voluntarily abolish its army. What happened after this is that the resources that used to be invested in the military were redirected to education and health. And this completely changed the development of our country and has been the case ever since. Our education system is recognized as one of the best in Latin America. We have one of the highest rates of literacy, educational coverage, and public spending in education. Since 1869, public primary education in our country was made free and mandatory. By Constitution, 8% of our country's GDP must be spent on public education. We have a robust technical and higher education system that is considered a benchmark in the region. However, and this is something that the ambassador of Germany also pointed out, education faces challenges in all countries, and that is the case with Costa Rica. There is a dropout rate that grows as secondary education is completed, and a growing unemployment rate among young people. Many people are obtaining degrees, but they're not being able to insert themselves properly in the labor market. There is also a clear need to connect the secondary education system with the labor market in order to generate social mobility and sustain progress. This is one of the many challenges that we are facing. So coming back to the question of how do we join efforts to achieve quality education, I would like to emphasize the three priorities I mentioned before: accessibility, affordability, and quality. Accessibility, what does it deal with? It deals with access to school, such as the distance between the school and communities. It has to do with the need to provide access for people with disabilities, to enable access for women and minorities, to attend school without any fear of discrimination, to build inclusive and safe schools. Public schools, it's important to remember, constitute a space that reduces, and I think Mr. Kumari also mentioned this of education, reduces social inequality in our society. The pandemic highlighted the differences between rich and poor households in terms of learning conditions and internet connectivity. This reinforces the need to invest not only in the infrastructure of government schools, but also in its digital infrastructure. Affordability. This addresses the question of whether all people can afford education, which must also take into account access to books and materials, as well as the existence of school canteen programs and daycare centers for early childhood. This implies that funding for education should not be reduced, and we know governments are facing difficulties after the pandemic, but public spending in education should not be reduced, but rather increased. And the last priority, and perhaps the most important of all, is quality. As we know, and I think Dr. Sadie mentioned, having a high school diploma or college degree does not necessarily lead to a well-paying job or a good life, or the possibility to properly care for one's family. A quality education is directly linked to having a decent job and opportunities that allow for economic growth at the individual level. This in turn contributes to our country's economic growth and high levels of well-being. We need to develop and implement comprehensive, innovative, attractive curriculums that offer skills for present, but not only present, also future jobs, to lifelong learning opportunities as the SDG 4 mandates. We need, and I think Dr. Sadie, you mentioned, we need to invest in people. We need to invest in teachers. We need to increase the supply of qualified teachers in developing countries. Teachers have an essential role to play. Governments and private-public partnerships must ensure that the necessary conditions of teachers and their needs are met through appropriate training, guidance, and competitive salaries. We need to make the teaching profession attractive. We need to create good human relationships between teachers, students, and families. We may invest in infrastructure and have a beautiful school, but if we don't have properly trained teachers, there's nothing we're doing in that building. We look forward to the discussions of this summit and to learning about the different approaches to education and the changes that are being proposed by many of you, especially the youth. We must, like we said at the beginning, double our efforts to achieve this SDG 4 and especially to leave no one behind. Thank you very much. Namaste.